Roaring Twenties, a time period synonymous with fun and lavish spending. In America, the invention of the washing machine, refrigerator, and automobile gave middle-class people more time to relax and enjoy pursuits, such as listening to jazz music and dancing to Charleston. Some women known as flappers, liberated by their new right to vote, bobbed their hair, wore short skirts, and showed a new disregard for expected behavior. Yet in this heyday, there was a darker side. The banning of alcohol in 1920 had led to the rise of organized crime, with gangsters like Al Capone making it big running illegal alcohol syndicates. Banning of alcohol in the 1920s is referred to as prohibition. Prohibition means the act of forbidding something, especially by law. In this context, alcohol. In the United States, from January 1920 to December 1933, the production, transportation, and sale of alcohol was banned nationwide. Many people had pushed for prohibition for years, but like any political issue, not everyone agreed that alcohol should be banned. The conflicts over prohibition ran very deep throughout American society and created a rift that was difficult to mend. Two sides of prohibition could be simplified into those who supported temperance, the banning of alcohol, were known as a dry, while those opposing were referred to as wets. There were two main dry groups, the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded in 1874 out of the Women's Crusades, held in 1873 to 1874. The Crusades involved protests like hymn singings and pray-ins at local bars and saloons to ask the owners to close up shop. Sometimes, the women would stand in two lines in front of the entrance of the saloon so that anyone going in had to walk between them. Ironically, the Women's Crusades all began from a man, Dr. D.O. Lewis. In 1873, he gave a temperance speech in Fredonia, New York. After the speech, 100 women marched to a nearby saloon to request the owner to close. Over the next few months, thousands of women followed suit, but they were unorganized, and it ended in 1874, 1 year later. The crusade against alcohol was a protest by women in part of their lack of civil rights. Women could not vote. There were no legal protections for women and children. Prosecutions for rape were rare, and the state-regulated age of consent was as low as 7. The other prominent temperance group was the Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1893. The Anti-Saloon League tied their opposition to the use of alcohol as being against Christian values. The founder of the Anti-Saloon League, Wayne Wheeler, was considered to be one of the most powerful voices in politics at the time. Part of the reason he was so influential was his willingness to work with any group that supported temperance. For example, he worked with suffragists because he knew women would vote for dry candidates. Yet he was also willing to work with other opposition groups, such as the KKK, a very dissimilar group from the typical suffragists. The KKK was extremely xenophobic, blaming the ills of society upon black and immigrant groups. Alcohol and modern, loose values were especially considered to be a part of the lives of many immigrant and African Americans. For all these reasons, the Ku Klux Klan was a temperance group. There were pro-alcohol groups during this time as well, although not as many. One pro-alcohol group, the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment Group, was founded in 1918 by Captain William Staton. The AAPA argued that the issue of prohibition should be settled at the state level, not the federal government. The business of alcohol was very lucrative, so as you might imagine, saloon owners and manufacturers of alcohol did not support prohibition. The economic power and control of alcohol was long an issue in the history of America. One example of the strong feelings people felt about liquor can be seen in the Whiskey Rebellion. Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton proposed a whiskey tax to help pay off the debt of the American Revolution. The reactions to this were so swift and strong that President Washington himself had to lead the militia to quash the actions of rebellious farmers living on the western frontier. They sometimes turned their grain into liquor for easier shipping and were willing to physically battle this unfair tax on people who could not afford it. Each group wanted opposing things. Temperance groups wanted prohibition, and pro-alcohol groups did not, and neither side was willing to budge. Due to loud and persistent protests, temperance won, and on January 16, 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified. 1 year later, it went into effect, prohibiting the production, transportation, and sale of alcohol throughout all of the United States. However, there was a loophole. The 18th Amendment didn't actually say that the consumption of alcohol was illegal. So before the amendment took effect, some people bought out entire liquor stores so they could still drink after the new law was ratified. Less than a year into Prohibition, the Volstead Act, or the National Prohibition Act, was passed in October. It decreed that jail time should range between 5 months and 5 years. One of the main points of argument that temperance supporters used to help convince legislators to pass the Prohibition Act was that outlawing alcohol would lower crime. This was quickly found to be completely incorrect, as was proven in the first hour of the existence of the law in Chicago. 6 armed men were arrested for stealing medicinal whiskey from a freight train. Gangsters saw a new opportunity, an opportunity to cash in on America's desire for liquor. The most famous gangster who rose to power during the 20s and 30s was Al Capone, who ran the Chicago outfit. Al Capone was born on January 17, 1899 in Brooklyn, New York. He attended Catholic school. When he was in the 6th grade, he punched a teacher and never went back. He began a life of crime, allying himself with the leader of a mafia criminal empire, Johnny Torrio. When Johnny Torrio retired, Al Capone took over running the Chicago Mafia. He made around $60 million a year running Chicago's speakeasies and bootlegging operations. Al Capone committed many crimes but only went to jail twice. Once was for carrying illegal weapons and the second time for prohibition and tax evasion charges. He served some time in Atlanta and some in Alcatraz. He is known as one of Alcatraz's most famous prisoners. Speakeasies were a dime a dozen during Prohibition. A speakeasy is a bar or nightclub that sold alcohol illegally. The word came from bartenders telling customers to talk quieter or speak easy. Speakeasies often had a man outside who customers would give a secret password to. An example of a speakeasy is NYC's The Back Room, one of 100,000 speakeasies in New York City alone. If you were to walk downstairs labeled the Lower East Side Toy Company, go straight up the stairs and to the right, you would be in the back room. Speakeasies would usually have secret exits to escape arrest if necessary. The back room had 6. The government tried to combat speakeasies by raiding them for liquor and to arrest people inside. The wine industry is another great example of the lengths American citizens went to find loopholes in the Prohibition legislation. The beginning of Prohibition caused great economic trouble for the wine industry. Owners of wineries quickly realized they had 2 options: tear up their grapes and plant something else, or find a way to continue growing and selling grapes. Laws said vineyards could grow grapes if they weren't for alcoholic purposes. So vineyards came up with wine bricks, bricks of grape juice that are marketed for non-alcoholic purposes. These bricks even included a warning on what not to do, which was conveniently the exact thing a person would need to do to make wine. Another thriving industry on the West Coast in the 1890s and into the early 1900s were opium dens that were tied to opium routes from Vancouver and Victoria in Canada to Portland, Oregon. When Prohibition began, this existing illicit network just switched their products. Instead of opium, they started smuggling liquor. This was frustrating for the Coast Guard, since the ships couldn't be touched in international waters, and the small launches were usually too fast to catch. Alcohol wasn't just smuggled in from outside the United States. Moonshining, the making of illegal alcohol at home, and bootlegging, the transportation of illegal alcohol, were also very common. Although both of these activities were illegal and directly in conflict with the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, they flourished across the nation. An example of one successful group of moonshiners and bootleggers is the Jenna Brothers, nicknamed the Terrible Jenna Brothers by the newspapers. The 5 brothers, Angela, Sam, Peter, Mike, and Tony Jenna, ran an illegal and prosperous alcohol smuggling ring in Little Sicily, an area in Chicago. The Jennas typically hired recent immigrants from Italy to make batches of homemade liquor called bathtub gin. The immigrants would be paid around $15 a day, $105 a day, or would work to pay back previous debts. It was dangerous, as the stills filled with gin would sometimes explode. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, as organized crime surged and the usage of alcohol continued to be widespread, it was clear that Prohibition wasn't working. The amazing things that were promised by temperance supporters simply weren't coming true. Law enforcers were too easily bribed, and the enforcement of the 18th Amendment was extremely expensive, with the cost determined to be around $300 million to enforce. This extremely large cost that the U.S. government had to bear to combat these expenses, along with the loss of $11 billion in lost tax revenue, prompted the federal government to repeal the 18th Amendment by passing the 21st Amendment on December 5, 1933. It made alcohol legal nationwide, though some counties to this day are still dry. FDR, the president at the time, reportedly said, "What this country needs now is a drink." There was no way to compromise on keeping any part of Prohibition. After 13 years, alcohol became legal and Prohibition was gone. Prohibition's effects are long and far-reaching, but include the growth of organized crime, increased violence and murder, death from tainted bootleg alcohol, political corruption, and increase in illegal drug use. The conflict to try and force Prohibition was just far too great, and no amount of compromise could make this ill-advised policy functional. The Roaring Twenties, flappers, jazz, and Prohibition. Although it may be remembered as a time of fun, the banning of liquor in 1920 led to the rise of organized crime and may have changed history forever.